The word that broke Harlem's silence. Harlem had heard insults before. It had swallowed them for decades, pressed them down into cracked sidewalks and tired lungs, into men who worked twice as hard for half the reward, and women who learned to smile through disrespect. Harlem was familiar with pain. It lived with it. But this time, the word didn't land quietly. It happened on a hot afternoon when the city felt impatient, when tempers simmered and sidewalks buzzed with movement. The crowd wasn't large at first, just a handful of men outside a private club that pretended it didn't see color while enforcing it with quiet precision. The suits were expensive, the shoes polished, the smiles careless. Muhammad Ali hadn't yet become a myth. He was still a man in motion, proud, outspoken, magnetic. His confidence made some people uneasy, especially those who believed confidence was something that had to be granted, not claimed. The word came from one of them. Casual, loud enough to sting. A single word meant to reduce a man to a place beneath the speaker. Boy. The street went still. Ali didn't flinch. That alone unsettled the men who laughed afterward, the kind of laughter meant to prove control. He simply looked at them, not with anger, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous: certainty. Across Harlem, moments like this often passed without consequence. Survival taught people when to walk away. But this moment didn't disappear into the noise of the city. It traveled. Fast. It reached a man who had built his entire life on one principle: no one disrespects Harlem and walks away unchanged. Bumpy Johnson was sitting quietly when he heard. He didn't shout, he didn't curse, he didn't slam his hand on the table. He simply went silent. Those who knew him understood what that silence meant. Bumpy Johnson was not impulsive, he was deliberate. Every move he made carried weight because he understood something most men never did. Power wasn't in how loudly you reacted, but in how patiently you waited. He asked one question: who said it? The room shifted. Bumpy had seen Harlem humiliated too many times, men called less than men, women treated as invisible, brilliance dismissed because it didn't come wrapped in the right skin or accent. He had fought his way out of poverty not just to survive, but to stand as a wall between Harlem and those who thought it was easy to step on. This wasn't about Muhammad Ali alone, and it certainly wasn't about pride. It was about a line being crossed. Joe Louis had crossed that line years earlier in a different way, not with words, but with presence. He had fought with grace, carried himself with restraint, and proved excellence didn't need permission. Bumpy respected that kind of strength. Ali carried the same fire, louder perhaps, but no less earned. And now, outsiders thought they could remind him of his place. That mistake would echo. Bumpy didn't rush to confrontation. Instead, he walked Harlem that evening. He stopped by barbershops where men argued about the day's news, where radios hummed and mirrors reflected generations of struggle. He listened more than he spoke. Mothers lowered their voices when they mentioned the incident. Young men clenched their jaws. Everyone felt it. Disrespect had a ripple effect. It reminded people of every door closed, every opportunity denied, every time they were told to wait while others moved ahead. Harlem was tired of waiting. Bumpy knew war didn't always begin with fists or bullets. Sometimes it began with refusal. Refusal to accept the insult, refusal to pretend it didn't matter, refusal to let history repeat itself without resistance. The men responsible belonged to a world that believed it owned the city. Their power wasn't just money, it was arrogance, the assumption that nothing touched them unless they allowed it. They had mistaken Harlem's patience for weakness. Bumpy planned to correct that misunderstanding. That night, he sent messages, not threats, not ultimatums, quiet reminders. Businesses that relied on Harlem suddenly found deliveries delayed, meetings lost their certainty, doors that were always open became strangely closed. No violence, no spectacle, just pressure.
the kind that made powerful men uncomfortable. Ali, unaware of the full chain reaction, trained as he always did. He joked with reporters, floated through routines, spoke about belief and destiny. But even he felt it, a subtle shift, like the city standing a little taller behind him. Joe Louis heard too. He said little, as always, but when he met Bumpy later that week, their exchange was brief and heavy with meaning. "Words matter," Louis said. Bumpy nodded. So do responses. By the end of the week, the men who laughed on that sidewalk were no longer laughing. Their phones rang more often. Their associates asked questions they didn't like. Deals stalled. Respect, once assumed, had to be negotiated again. Still, Bumpy hadn't made his move. Not yet. Because the real lesson wasn't about revenge, it was about remembrance, reminding the city who it was and reminding those who underestimated it that dignity was not optional. Harlem was watching, and the people who had used that word were about to learn something they had never been taught before. Some lines, once crossed, don't invite an argument. They invite a reckoning. When power realizes it's being watched. By the time the city realized something had changed, it was already too late to undo it. Harlem didn't announce its shift with sirens or speeches. It moved the way it always had when history leaned too hard on its back. Quietly, collectively, with an awareness that everyone felt but few could describe. Store owners noticed it first, the subtle hesitation in transactions that once moved smoothly, the phone calls that didn't return the same confidence they used to. Men who walked into rooms expecting obedience suddenly sensed resistance, not loud or defiant, but firm enough to disrupt certainty. Bumpy understood that this was the moment when pressure became awareness, and awareness became fear, because fear never arrived with panic, it arrived with questions. The men responsible for the insult began to ask those questions among themselves, confused by how quickly their influence felt less solid than it had days earlier. They told themselves it was coincidence, that Harlem was just being difficult again, that these things always corrected themselves. But Bumpy knew arrogance always followed the same pattern. Denial first, then irritation, then mistakes. He waited for the mistakes, because mistakes were where leverage lived. He had no interest in chaos. Chaos was for people who didn't understand timing. What he wanted was acknowledgement, the kind that came when powerful people realized the ground beneath them was no longer guaranteed. Muhammad Ali continued training, but his presence alone had become a symbol without him needing to say a word. Young men gathered closer when he passed, not because he asked them to, but because confidence had gravity. Ali had never learned how to shrink himself, and Harlem responded to that refusal as if it were permission to breathe deeper. He spoke about discipline, about belief, about refusing to let others define the size of your future, and each sentence landed heavier now because it echoed the mood of the streets. Even those who didn't follow boxing felt it, the sense that someone was finally standing in full view and refusing to bow, not with anger, but with certainty. Joe Louis watched all of this from a distance, his understanding shaped by years of restraint rather than spectacle. He had learned long ago that respect earned through silence lasted longer than respect demanded through noise. Yet even he recognized that Ali represented something new, something necessary for a generation that no longer wanted to wait politely for approval. When Louis met with Bumpy again, there was no strategy discussed out loud, no planning in the traditional sense. There didn't need to be. The plan wasn't written down because it wasn't about action alone. It was about atmosphere. Harlem didn't need instructions, it needed reassurance that someone powerful was paying attention. That reassurance changed behavior almost immediately. Men who once laughed openly at insults now lowered their voices. Business arrangements that relied on intimidation suddenly required negotiation. The men who believed they could say anything without consequence began to understand that consequence didn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrived as isolation, as doors that closed gently but firmly, as silence where compliance used to be. Bumpy's influence wasn't visible on the surface, but it threaded through everything. connecting people who had waited years to feel protected by something other than their own endurance. The Genovese name carried weight in other parts of the city, but Harlem had its own gravity, and gravity didn't argue. It pulled. Meetings were requested, not demanded. Messages were delivered with careful wording. Even apologies were considered, though none were spoken yet, because pride still resisted reality. Bumpy anticipated that resistance. He understood that humiliation was never his goal. Clarity was. He wanted them to understand that Harlem was not a place you pass through without consequence, not a backdrop for disrespect, not a stage where others performed dominance without being challenged. What unsettled his opponents most was the absence of spectacle. There were no confrontations to respond to, no incidents to exploit, no chaos to control.
The moment pride became a liability. Power rarely collapses all at once. It fractures slowly, beginning with doubt, then hesitation, and finally fear disguised as strategy. The men who once believed they controlled every room now found themselves recalculating every step, wondering which silence meant patience and which meant judgment. Harlem no longer reacted the way it used to, and that absence of predictability unsettled them more than open resistance ever could. They had built their authority on routine responses, on intimidation that produced compliance, on a city that learned when to look away. But now Harlem looked directly back, calm and unafraid, and that gaze carried the weight of generations who had learned too much to be fooled again. Bumpy Johnson understood that this stage was the most dangerous, not because of violence, but because of desperation. When powerful people realized they were no longer untouchable, they often tried to reassert control in subtle ways, gestures meant to remind others who they thought they were. Invitations were sent that sounded polite but carried expectations. Conversations were initiated that pretended to seek peace while quietly testing boundaries. Bumpy listened without committing, responded without revealing, and allowed his opponents to feel just enough uncertainty to expose their own weaknesses. He had learned long ago that patience was not passive, it was an active force that exhausted those who relied on intimidation. Meanwhile, Harlem continued its quiet transformation. Young men who once felt invisible now spoke with intention, not recklessness, but confidence rooted in self-respect. Barbershops became places of reflection instead of frustration, where discussions weren't about survival alone, but about dignity, about how a single moment of unchecked disrespect could ripple outward until it demanded a response. Muhammad Ali's presence amplified that energy without him needing to confront anyone directly. His refusal to internalize humiliation became instructional, a living example of how strength didn't require permission. He trained, he spoke, he laughed, and each action reinforced the idea that identity was not something others could shrink with a word. Joe Louis observed the shift with a quieter satisfaction, recognizing something familiar in the way Harlem moved now. It reminded him of moments before historic change, when people hadn't yet named what was happening but felt it deeply enough to protect it. He spoke to younger fighters about discipline and restraint, about choosing when to respond and when silence carried more authority, and his words landed differently now because the city was ready to hear them. Harlem wasn't looking for heroes, it was learning to see itself as worthy without external validation, and that realization altered everything. The men who had sparked the insult attempted to reclaim narrative control, quietly suggesting that the situation had been misunderstood, that no offense had been intended, that things had simply been exaggerated. But explanations offered too late sounded less like clarity and more like retreat. Their associates noticed the shift as well, the way Harlem no longer bent instinctively, the way influence had to be negotiated rather than assumed. Deals required respect, conversations required acknowledgement. The old shortcuts no longer worked, and each failed attempt to reassert dominance confirmed what they feared most. The city had changed its posture, and posture was the foundation of power. Bumpy chose this moment to speak, not loudly, not publicly, but deliberately through channels that carried weight without spectacle. His message was simple and impossible to misinterpret. Respect was not optional, and dignity was not negotiable. There would be no chaos, no public confrontation, no dramatic declarations, but there would also be no return to the way things had been before. The line that had been crossed could not be uncrossed, only learned from. Those who understood this would continue to do business. Those who didn't would find Harlem increasingly unavailable to them. That realization landed heavily. Pride, once a shield, became a liability. The men who had relied on reputation now understood that reputation only mattered if others agreed to believe in it, and belief had shifted. Harlem no longer accepted inherited authority without proof of respect, and proof required behavior, not words. The insult that began everything had become irrelevant compared to what followed, because the true conflict was no longer about a moment of disrespect, but whether a city would continue to accept being treated as lesser. As the pressure intensified, so did the clarity. Bumpy didn't need to escalate. The situation escalated itself through the weight of realization. Harlem was no longer reacting to power, it was defining it on its own terms, and those who had underestimated that transformation now stood at a crossroads, forced to decide whether they would adapt or resist a reality that no longer needed their approval. The reckoning had not yet arrived, but its shape was visible now, unavoidable and steady. This was no longer about confrontation, it was about consequence, and consequence, once set in motion, did not require force to complete its work. It only required time. When a city chooses who it becomes, the final shift did not arrive with confrontation or spectacle, but with acceptance, and that acceptance carried more weight than any public display ever could. Those who once believed themselves untouchable finally understood that the city they moved through had changed its rules without asking permission, and the most unsettling truth they faced was that nothing they could do would reverse it. Harlem no longer reacted out of fear or habit, it responded out of awareness, and awareness could not be intimidated. Bumpy Johnson watched this realization settle into the air like a permanent weather change, subtle but undeniable, and he knew then that the moment had passed its point of return. The insult that sparked everything had lost its power, not because it was forgiven, but because it had been outgrown. Meetings that once would have been avoided were now requested with humility, and even those requests carried a different tone, one stripped of entitlement and laced with caution. Bumpy listened without triumph, because triumph was never his goal. He understood that true victory didn't require humiliation of others, it required the elevation of those who had been conditioned to accept less. His response was measured and final, making it clear that Harlem would not be ruled by resentment, but it would also never again be ruled by disregard. Respect would be the entry price for any future relationship, and those unwilling to pay it would simply find themselves excluded without drama or announcement. Muhammad Ali felt the change not in applause or headlines, but in the way people looked at him now, not as a symbol to be tested, but as a man whose confidence had helped unlock something collective. He spoke openly about self-worth, about refusing to let anyone shrink you with language, and those words landed deeper because the city had lived their truth. Ali didn't claim credit, and that humility only strengthened his influence. He had stood tall when it mattered, and Harlem had stood with him, discovering that pride didn't have to shout to be heard. Joe Louis, watching the conclusion unfold, understood that this was the rare kind of ending history often missed, the kind without a single dramatic image, but full of permanent change. He saw younger men carry themselves differently, speak with intention instead of defensiveness, and approach opportunity with the expectation of fairness rather than the fear of dismissal. The lesson settled quietly into the culture. Dignity was not a request, it was a standard. Once set, it reshaped everything that followed. The men who once used that careless word moved forward altered by the experience, whether they admitted it or not. Some adapted, learning that influence without respect was temporary. Others faded from relevance, unable to operate in a space where intimidation no longer produced results. Harlem did not celebrate their decline, it simply continued forward, unconcerned with proving anything to those who no longer understood it. A city chose growth over bitterness, clarity over chaos, and that choice insulated it from future disrespect more effectively than any threat ever could. Bumpy Johnson walked Harlem one evening as the noise of the city returned to its familiar rhythm, and for the first time in a long while, the streets felt lighter. Not because struggle had disappeared, but because something heavier had been lifted. The people had remembered who they were, and memory had done its work. He knew history would never record this moment the way it recorded battles or headlines, but that didn't matter. Some victories were meant to be lived, not documented. In the end, no war was declared out loud, no dramatic surrender was staged, no public apology was demanded. What changed was far more enduring. A city decided it would no longer accept being diminished.